Okay, wonderful. So hi everyone, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us for this launch panel and conversation of TAD issue 8.2, themed coding. My name is Theodora Vardouli. I'm joining from McGill University in Montreal in Canada, and I served as issue editor for coding. So just to give you a sense of the structure of our issues, so as you may know at TAD, every issue features a series of solicited articles, short guest editorials that are curated by the issue editor and give diverse perspectives on the issue's theme. There's also articles from our peer review pipeline, which are expertly shepherded to publication by a team of associate editors. For coding, these were Patricia Kio and Dimitris Papanikolaou, who I'm happy to see here. The issue also features a details plus piece, which is prepared by design editor David Newton. Hi, David, who's also responsible for making TAD a very beautiful object. And overseeing everything in admirably tireless ways is our executive editor, Elise Newman, who will say a few words as well in a bit. So our launch panel today is a conversation among our solicited authors, the opposition species authors, who contributed 5 stunningly diverse, I think, pieces addressing the theme of coding. My hope and aim as issue editor was to offer a kaleidoscopic reading of coding to illuminate it as a diverse, variegated practice. And I think the pieces of the authors who are joining us today really achieve that in wonderful ways. And on a personal level, I wanted to say that there's no greater satisfaction than assembling essays from scholars and colleagues who I admire so greatly. And even better, having them together today in conversation. So just to give you a sense of how today's gonna go, we have about an hour. I ran over for a few minutes. So I will very briefly introduce the authors, then give the floor to Elise for a few remarks. And then we have planned this as a kind of question relay of sorts, where authors will ask questions to each other. And then we're hoping that towards the end, we'll have a little bit of time for questions from the audience, as well as editorial board members who are joining us today. Can recognize them by the blue background. So we're truly, truly thrilled to have with us today Peggy Deamer, whose essay was on codes of ethics. So Peggy is a professor of architecture at Yale University and principal in Deamer Architects, previously Deamer and Phillips Architects. Thank you for joining us. Bernard Geoghegan, who contributed an essay on the geoscopic drive. So Bernard is a reader in the history and theory of digital media at King's College London, and you're currently engaged in a research residency in Econis. Is that correct? Great. Thank you for joining us. So Anna Maria Meister, who wrote on coded objects. She's leading the Lise Meitner Research Group at Kunsthistorisches Institut in Florence, Max Planck Institute. She's a professor at KIT Karlsruhe and co-director of the Psi Archive. Thank you for joining us, Anna Maria. Vernelle Noel, who wrote on repairing code, craft, and computation. Vernelle is an assistant professor of computational design at Carnegie Mellon University and directs the Situated Computation and Design Lab there. Great to have you here, Vernelle. And Adam Marcus, who's actually representing today a kind of joint co-authored effort with Andrew Kudlas. So their essay is called Drawn Together. So Adam Marcus is an associate professor of architecture at Tulane University and directs Variable Projects, an architectural research studio in New Orleans. And as I mentioned, Andrew Kudlas unfortunately couldn't be here today, but Andrew is the Bill Kendall Memorial Endowed Professor at the University of Houston's Hines College of Architecture Design and the Advanced Media Technology Lab Director. So it's truly a dream team of authors. We're very happy to have you here today and really excited for the conversation. So Elise, I pass it to you. You want to say a few words, and then we can pass it to our authors. Yeah. Elise, you're on mute. It always happens.
Always happens. Hey, there you go. So just to start, thanks, Theodora. I just want to mention a quick thing. In addition to being the issue editor for this issue, Theodora is also our communications editor for TAD. And that's important because she's actually instrumental in sort of organizing this first ever panel that we're doing for this. So we're very excited about that. Theodora, thank you. I just wanted to give you a shout out for that. I would also be remiss if I don't thank our ACSA partners and support. They are amazing. So Mike Monty, who's the director, but a couple of staff in particular, Danielle Dent, Julia McKenzie, who's our managing director, and then of course Hanifa Jones, who's on the call with us today. She's the director of digital marketing and communications manager for ACSA. So thank you all. Nothing would really be possible for us and therefore for TAD without their support. Of course, thank you to all the authors who have agreed to do this. We really appreciate it. And thanks for agreeing to do the articles to begin with, right? Without your support, this portion of the journal would not be as strong, right? That you are critical to letting that kind of focus theme area really unfold as a discourse in the journal. Our peer review pieces are sometimes related to that theme, but not always. In this particular one, coding, there was quite a wide response to the call for papers. And I think you might see some resonance even in the peer review papers with some of the themes that were brought out in your solicited authorship. What I also want to mention is that what you can see in this particular issue, and I see it in the authors sitting in front of me, is the broad range of applicability for this discussion, right? So on the one hand, from practice, so concerns that come out of ethics about practice, to questions about, I would say, really epistemology, right? About the questions of coding, to social issues and political concerns in all sorts of realms. So coding really hit a lot of topics, a lot of discussion, broad range. It reminded me of, Heidegger's famous dictum that, the essence of technology is not anything particularly technological, right? It's much, much broader. It's really a way of revealing. And I think that really did come through in your articles as well as the peer review articles in this issue. So from that sense, I think it was quite successful. My hope for this and for almost any issue that we produce on a topic is that, and I'm going to quote Bateson here because I've always liked this, the difference that makes a difference is really what we're looking for, right? That somehow out of the free zone of this discussion of the sort of the way the articles situate themselves throughout the journal, and then from issue to issue even, right? So circularity to climate, coding to generative, that you're starting to see a discussion basically even between the issues. So my hope would be that this is the difference that makes a difference in our discipline as we move forward. We have a lot to say and we can have a lot of affect, but we've not yet, I think, really had a good seat at the table for a while. So it's time to get our seat back. Welcome all. Thank you. And I'm going to open the floor.
Did you want me to start?
Yes,
absolutely,
dive right
Adam.
in? Okay.
I think that was
Great.
tag. You're it.
All right. Well, thank you, Elise and Theodora, for organizing this and for, organizing the whole issue and inviting Andrew and I to contribute to this essay. I have the pleasure of starting our tag team process today with Vernelle Noel, my great colleague and friend. Vernelle, it's great to see you. I really enjoyed reading your essay, especially since we're in the height of carnival season here in New Orleans. I think what your essay does so well is articulate possible relationships between coding and notions of repair. how coding might bridge computational practice, which is so often the domain of the technocratic and the esoteric, with material craft traditions and cultural specificity, which is the term that you use. Of course, in reference specifically in your piece to the carnival traditions in Trinidad. I'm interested in this relationship between code and craft, and in particular, the role of labor, the importance of labor. In material practices, the sense of craft, which is actually pretty hard to define, is usually inextricably tied to a substantial amount of labor required to produce a work of high quality. And in coding, of course, coding also requires a significant amount of labor and time to get it right. Coding skills develop over many years, thousands of hours, et cetera, as we all know. So I guess to begin, Vernelle, I wonder if you see coding itself as a form of craft. And if so, how such an understanding might dovetail with the critical social, political, and ethical questions that you center in your essay.
Thank you very much, Adam, for a lovely question. Lovely to see you too. Lovely to see everybody. And thank you, Elise and Theodora, for making this happen. Thank you, all of TAD, for the labor, as Adam just mentioned, that went into this. We appreciate it greatly. So to your questions of labor, Adam, and whether I see coding as a craft, craft is always debatable from depending on who is attempting to define and frame what craft is. And many times I've said, you know what, I'm not going to define what craft is. It keeps moving. It's a fluid thing that changes. So I'm not going to fight the word in any particular way. What your question did make me think of when it comes to labor, were the different expressions and I think experiences and possibilities for those labors. So as you rightly mentioned, there is also labor involved in coding practices. If we think of coding practices as, you know, computational programming, etc., if we think of those sort of coding practices, one thing that comes to mind is pleasure when it comes to what I think is quickly described as labor in craft practices, that sometimes it could be labor, but sometimes it's a refining of a skill that is pleasurable. And so I think the same thing with coding. Sometimes, you know, you get in the flow and it's a pleasure. So there is a fine line sometimes between when the pleasurable becomes labor. So that comes to mind. But also coding as a form of craft, I think the difference is also probably in the representation or the outcome of the work, such that the work of someone making something physically engaging in a material practice, there is a connection that one directly makes between the person making the thing and the outcome, which is a result of visible and invisible forces, systems, materials, spaces that make these things happen. While I think coding could conceal some of that, right? So coding, I think, conceals the social, it conceals the spatial, it conceals some of the labors that goes into making, if it's physical things, these physical things materializable. So I'm not answering your question of if coding is a craft well, but I'm thinking through the different outcomes and processes of engaging in acts of making, production, and creativity, and what those different experiences might be, and how we might connect the human making the thing and the resulting outcome. So I don't know if I answered your question. It's a beautiful question that made me think.
Yeah, I love your response, especially this question of pleasure, linking labor to pleasure and craft, kind of the network between those three things. I think, you know, I think I should probably hand it off because we want to get through everyone. I could keep going on this, but I wonder, I'm interested in how these questions might overlap also with Peggy's piece and thinking about, you know, coders as workers as well, and the labor that's going into these processes as part of this kind of larger questions of labor in architecture.
I want to add just a quick one. What struck me as you were talking, Vernelle, too, is a distinction between what might be handmade versus craft. Do you know what I'm saying? This is a question I have, and it kind of harkens back to the Mutesius van de Velde discussion in some ways at the turn of the last, well, now it's 2 centuries ago, technically. But, you know, this idea of what's the distinction between those in this case? Because I don't necessarily know this is an argument about the machine versus man, particularly.
Yes.
But there's something more subtle going on here. I'm just throwing it out there. It's what struck me as you were talking. I agree. I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll stop. But
No, good, all good stuff. Do you want me to move on and ask Anna Maria now?
Yeah, sure, Vernelle. Unless you have
Okay.
anything to respond to Elise's, but we can keep it going. It's wonderful that in your piece also coding is expanded kind of beyond the digital, and that you're thinking about coding as a kind of broader computational practice. So yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Anna Maria, lovely to meet you. Lovely to read your essay, a lovely one. In your essay, you talk about coded objects as methods to make visible or to make noticeable the formal and material implications of different types of code. Code and objects as material consisting of matter intentionally shaped by someone or something, and of skills manipulable by objects, right? What I enjoy about your definition and your placing of coding and objects beside each other is that in your work, you've revealed their materiality, their matter, agency of those who manipulate it. And I find your project to be almost meta, in that as I was looking at the images you provide that were in the article and the way you spoke about all these entanglements of these objects, that you bring to bear on the objects, the evidences that you ask that we consider as we review these coded objects are themselves coded objects, right? So it's like this recursive situation of coded objects making light of other coded objects, making light of other coded objects. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what it might tell us about how we as different forms of practitioners, architects, designers, etc., what it might say to help us in our framing and thinking with code in this way?
Yeah, thank you so much. Also, I just thought when you were talking, when I read your essay, that in a way your essay is almost like a sequel to what I'm thinking about. So there's a really nice kind of what happens after the object, and then when things, you know, need repair and care. But to your question, so yeah, it's a little bit the thing I struggle with sometimes, because with these loops, of course, then, you know, you think in these loops, and then at a certain point, you always reach the point where like, okay, everything's coded, everything's like, where do you, what do you get out of it? And I think my attempt to answer your question, but also to answer this kind of research question would be that in a way, what we're trying to ask, or what I'm trying to ask is not what is an coded object, like which of these objects are coded and which are not, or maybe I ask how they're coded, but most of all, I think I try to figure out, is it productive to look at them as coded objects? So really methodologically, so if I presume this codedness, how I defined it, as bearing traces of manipulations, and you beautifully, I mean, you said it more beautiful than I wrote it. If I look at it like that, do I get closer to, do I understand it better? So in a way, what I'm interested in is maybe not, I just realized, not even the coding, that's the title of the issue, but decoding these objects, you know. So by assuming that they're already coded, I try to figure out if I can decode them better to then, which then links to Peggy's and other essays, of course, to critically really assess them through this method of assuming that they're coded and then read them this way. But I don't know if that answers the question, but that's how I try to think about it, whether it's productive, and it's not productive for all of them. So if it's not, then that's the wrong approach, let's say. Okay.
I love that. I love that. Can I ask a follow-up, or do we keep moving on?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. What motivated you to choose this approach, and how does this challenge paradigms that we might take as designers when it comes to designing or conducting design research?
Yeah, it's in a way, it's as often it's an autobiographical trajectory in some sense. So when I went to the US to do my PhD, I started thinking of all these, you know, German norms and codes, and then I wrote my dissertation on the DIN norms, or at least partially, and on all these kind of codes in also how Peggy writes about the actual architectural codes of, you know, how high has the door to be and what are the door handles to do, but then looked at the objects that these codes describe really as designed objects, and tried to understand that all of them were not bureaucratically legislated or regulated, but really shaped and designed by architects and engineers intentionally as physical objects, and then circumscribed with these kind of definitions of tolerance and definitions of materials. And that's kind of how I then started thinking about these objects, and then the norm sheets themselves as objects, and this whole yeah, that was the slippery slope, let's say, how this kind of started. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your questions. I'll move right to Bernard. And thank you so much for your essay. I mean, yeah, I think everybody of us feels like we wish we would have 1 hour to just talk about this one thing. Because when I read your essay, on the one hand, again, an autobiographical moment when you said, you know, media studies was so influenced by architectural scholars and the writing in the 1990s and 2000s. And that was when I started, or a bit later, when I started my PhD in the 2010s. It was, I experienced it as totally the other way around, that, you know, architecture scholars were looking at media studies and were so influenced by, you know, Siegert and others, and the how to look at maps and things and objects. And then I was wondering if the term code, the way that it travels, and of course it always changes, but the way it travels through these disciplinary appropriations, adaptations, and misreadings, or readings and misreadings, to what degree we are talking, they were even talking, to what degree they were actually even talking to each other, or maybe they were just misunderstanding each other productively, potentially, the entire time. So I would be interested in that aspect from your side, and then I have another question if we have time.
Thank you. I'm going to turn off the headphones. So first off, I just wanted to thank everyone who's here, and the journal, the designers did amazing work to make sure this came out properly illustrated, and Elise and Theodora offered extraordinary tips for revisions and so forth. So I've really learned a lot from doing this. So it's interesting. I wonder if, so one of the things I'm interested in is the way certain technical notions of code kind of flourished in 20th century thinking, humanities, social sciences, circulating from computing to other fields. And I wonder if there is here's what I'm interested in some way. And I think this is paradigmatic of a larger social issue where, okay, all of these people were using these terms in contradictory manners, right? And, misunderstanding each other, sometimes in very constructive ways. But they were misunderstanding each other through a common practice of kind of referring to technical standards, technical concepts, like, and just trying to understand the social world, the natural world, the political world in terms of kind of technical systems, right? And so, there's a way where I kind of like when I look at the way some of this technical language circulates, I sort of see the conversation as being totally fractured, and yet clearly some part of some collective process that has something to do with the type of technical society we're in. And the one thing I would add to that is this is also why I thought, coming from media studies, for thinking through a certain problem of the way practices get stabilized into codes and standards, architecture is such a like exemplary field because it kind of offers an exquisite model of this way in which the lived sensory practical world does get organized into these technical systems that are collective and shared, right? So, I kind of liked thinking of these two things together as being exemplary of what life has been like, at least for the last century, probably a lot longer.
It's perfect. Thank you. Because the follow-up question is, and as I said in the chat, I didn't thank anyone. So thank you, everyone. I'm sorry. The follow-up question is precisely about that, because we had a conversation the other day about the terminology of technology and how we still use it for, now also the large language models, the multi-neural network developments and all of that. And whether that even still applies, because it suggests a certain last century modern kind of separation between technology, human, technology, nature, and a kind of mechanical understanding of technology in a certain way, which might be completely misleading for a critical discourse that we need. And I wonder if the same, in a way, applies to code as well, whether coding, whether in the material sense, I think it still works very well in the sense that you used it, but whether moving forward, we might need other terminologies to critically assess what people are doing with the technology that might not be technology in the same way, to not lose what's happening, to not have an image of a kind of nostalgic, this is a mechanical technology that is controllable when it might not be.
So I always kind of think we need more and more plural vocabularies. In a weird way, I don't want to make too much of a leap, but some of what's been going on the last week with Silicon Valley and Trump and the administration, there are these technical systems we have to grapple with the way that they're imposing their logic on us constantly. So we need, and I think there's something to be said about collectively discussing them and dealing with, even if it's a political logic masked as techniques, you kind of got to talk about the techniques. And so on one hand, I sort of feel like the world forces us to confront that, if only to develop alternative vocabularies. But the other thing, like the large language model interests me because it kind of, I think it's a little relevant to this issue. So I've been reading on deep learning, like reading some of the foundational deep learning articles from the 2010s. And for me, two things that interest me is, number one, they talk a great deal about mapping. You know what I mean? Because part of the way they break up phenomena is they produce them into maps and visual schemes. And then those maps, and I'm reminded here of Svetlana Alper's early 1980s book on Vermeer and, Dutch painting, where she talked about the rise of something like a cartographic impulse, and I sort of, when I look at this thing, I'm like, there's a mapping practice here, and I take these metaphors as being meaningful, right? And then they map it, and then they extract and organize things into codes. And so when that stuff happens, I wouldn't want to confuse it with all these diverse everyday meanings of the words, but it makes me think that issues like this, when they're talking about problems, broad, diverse notions of technical organization and logic of space, I think that's filtering into things like large language models. And when we read the technical details very closely, we start getting things that are aesthetic and political and social. So I think the more things get new, the more we get kind of thrown into the heart of some of these classic issues, I guess.
Thank you so much. Let's keep going.
Okay. So, Peggy, thanks for your extraordinary contribution. One of the things I was thinking about as I read your issue, I need to see if we get guests. One of the things I was thinking about as I read your essay was,
Hi, Papa.
hey, Lucian, I'm at work. I'm at a meeting.
I want to be with Papa.
Okay, you can, but you can't talk. Okay, so the one of the things I was thinking about when you're talking about codes of standards, codes of conduct, ethical codes in relationship to architecture, I found myself thinking of the work by these historians of technology and science, Starr and Lampland and Janet Abate, who, when they wrote about the history of standards and technical standards, of which I think code is, you're saying, it's a technical standard, but it's also an ethical phenomenon. They said, the things about standards is part of what they do is they try to centralize.
Papa.
Lucian, I need to talk. Okay. One of the things they tend to do is they try to centralize and standardize and produce norms for how people act. So there's a kind of tension in terms of their relationship to democracy, right? We believe that some kind of shared codes are necessary, but there's also a problem because you have to have some kind of imposition of authority on them. And so I wonder, when you think about developing ethical codes, where does democratic and collective processes enter into that, for example, in architecture?
That's not the question I imagine I would get, but I really appreciate that. And I too want to thank everybody. I have so enjoyed being part of this conversation. I think in some way I'm an outlier here, but I learned so much. And anyway, so I appreciate it. So in some way, your question implies that my wishing that there was in architecture a stronger code of ethics. In some way, you're implying that codifying that might be problematic or might be anti-democratic. And I guess I see it as making a stake in the ground that then we can debate. And so in that way, I really do think about this as radical democracy, which is, it's not a plea when we think about ethics for consensus. It's a plea for somebody making a stake so that then it can be debated and discussed and refined and adjusted. But until there is a stake in the ground, the conversation doesn't even begin. So I guess I would say I'm not looking for consensus. I'm just looking for a dialogue. So.
And related to that, it was funny. It was interesting that Vernelle.
Why are you
Lucian,
not letting?
Lucian, I need to talk. Okay, it was interesting that Vernelle had mentioned Carnival and coding, because I'm here in Basel and we're about to start Carnival. I was just finding out about how it worked, and one of the ways it works is that the marches are led by guilds, right? The guilds are the old families of Basel, but of course they come out of, the professional societies of the medieval era, right? And I was thinking about guilds as an example, because guilds, of course, building trades and things like that, they would have elaborate codes of conduct, right? But it sort of was held together through certain some kind of community, right? You had to have particular commitments to one another, to the city, to the civic sphere, even to the church and to the state, right? And I was trying to think if that's relevant to architectural codes of ethics. Does one need a certain kind of community of concern or a shared civic ground in order to have functioning codes? And what could that be in a kind of global world like we have today?
The answer is yes, yes, and yes. That is, I think, part of the plea that I'm making. I think it's a plea that we're all kind of making, which is to think about coding as a social norm that actually allows us or demands that we think about what that community is and what our obligation to that community is and how we codify it, what standards are consistent, what are not. I think in general, not just my article here about codes of ethics, but about architecture, labor, and trying to get a profession that wants us to foreground community and not competition, is very much about recognizing our shared concerns and our shared obligations, as opposed to who's going to get the job by greater efficiency or greater market value or whatever. So absolutely the community side of this. I mean, the model of the Guild, to me, is a very, very positive model. So, yes.
Seems to, I just want to touch on that though a little bit, Peggy, because it seems, I don't think you're an outlier here, because I think this is actually a critical issue in organizing the built environment at the moment in many ways. Coding, it transcends many areas, but it certainly is something that architecture, in many ways, through drawing, through representation, through standardized practices, through all these things, has dealt with coding for a long, long time. And it seemed to me that the one thing you brought to the table was this idea that those ethics could be aspirational, that they didn't have to be enforceable, right? So it was this idea that we've lost some of our desire to imagine a more positive society through that, through our work, right? Through the thing that we.
I appreciate your saying that. Thank you.
I guess I'll pass the baton.
Okay. So, Adam, hi. I totally loved your essay. I loved everybody's essay. I just have to say how deeply I felt what I thought would be a technological discussion, how deeply it goes to humanitarian concerns. And so anyway, but Adam, what struck me about your piece is just your love of architectural drawing. I mean, besides your effort to see coding as a sketch and to see sketching as an integral part of how we can generate new ideas and, expand our repertoire. I just thought, oh, this is somebody who just loves architecture and loves the role of representation in our creative practice. So then I'm just curious to know, because I don't know your background, whether the technical side of this drew you to your desire to get the 96 people to put forward their coding sketches, or whether you came to this from a more, I might say, traditional architectural representation side. So I'm curious about that.
Thanks, Peggy. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think the two of the primary motivations for the larger Drawing Codes project, I think one, it was grounded really kind of in pedagogy in our teaching work, and the other, let's say, more in maybe the technical, the professional practice, in the practice world of how technology is used. And so maybe to start with that, like I think, and the project kind of emerged organically in conversations between me and Andrew a while ago now, I think 8 years ago or so. And the initial exhibition began with the kind of recognition that, like, in practice now, so often drawings are really a kind of residual output that's required by permitting requirements or contractual obligations. And, the kind of paradigm of the BIM model, Revit, et cetera, has made it easy to create drawings as an output, but the drawing, to generalize, is no longer the kind of generative basis of creating architecture. And so we were interested in kind of challenging that model-based paradigm and thinking instead of, rather than drawings as models creating drawings of creating drawings without models, or maybe in a kind of nostalgic way, let's say, returning to that. The second motivation was pedagogical, as I mentioned, and really came out of our experience kind of, both Andrew and I, often teach design media courses, representation courses, introduction to computational design, a lot of digital fabrication, robotics. So we're deeply embedded in the technical, but, and this was a kind of realization maybe 7 or 8 years ago, but I think still pertains, that students, we would, curiously would say to us sometimes, oh, I'm not interested in learning. I don't need to learn parametric design or Grasshopper or whatever, because I'm not really interested in making buildings that look, like twisty towers or have excessive curvature, differentiated panelization, et cetera. And for me, that was very curious and kind of unfortunate that the kind of technical the tools, let's say, had become immediately associated with the kind of predetermined stylistic output. And this is related, to say parametricism and other isms. And we found that a kind of unfortunate byproduct, because as we all know, there are many things you can use these tools for beyond making twisty towers. And some of the more interesting uses of these tools are, let's say, the less visible, less related to form and geometry, and more related to labor, workflow, automation, et cetera. And so those kind of two motivations of like challenging the model-based paradigm and the role of drawings, and kind of trying to develop a critical approach to where computational design had ended up or has ended up, led us to think about, if we kind of gave this prompt to a set of contributors, folks who are working broadly in technology and design, and asked them to make one drawing about kind of foregrounding the role of technology in their practice, or the role of coding, what might come out of that. So it really began kind of as those two questions. I don't know if that answers your question.
Super interesting. And it's something that I really care a lot about. I think we all care a lot about, which is pedagogy and how technological tools are used in our architectural education. So you're kind of foregrounding that, as well as foregrounding the problems that we might be headed into as those tools are stylistically coded, or I don't know, I want to say almost epistemically coded for a certain thing about the thing that we should do. And this is where architecture is headed. And you're going to learn this thing that, so that you're a participant in where it's headed, and kind of stemming that off. So I really, really appreciate that. I don't want to go on, but it does seem to me, and when I go in reviews, I'm seeing a lot of mid-journey renderings, and I wonder whether that is one of the things that makes you scared, or whether this is just an opening up of a discussion that needs to happen. Maybe we don't have time to answer that too elaborately, but.
Well, I'll briefly maybe throw something in, and I think I know Theodora mentioned to me that the next issue, I think David's editing it, is on, it's called generatives, and so I imagine that issue, these questions will be central in the content of that issue. The book, the drawing codes book, and the project, partially because of kind of when the project was conceived, it doesn't take on the AI question like front and center. There are a number of drawings that certainly use, AI workflows, machine learning workflows, et cetera. But the kind of coda of the book, which overlaps quite a bit with the essay in this issue of TAD, returns to this notion of the sketch as the kind of generative catalyst for thinking about design, and how coding is a form of sketching. And I think, and my my collaborator Andrew Cudlis has written a lot more on the role of text to image, AI workflows like Midjourney, et cetera, and how those processes are less about, or the kind of power of those processes is really as a sketching tool, an ideation tool, and less as a kind of generating a building in one go process. And so I think I'm a little bit more skeptical of the Midjourney paradigm than Andrew is, I think. So I can't speak for him, but I do agree. I think thinking about it as a sketching tool in hybridization, in collaboration, in conjunction with many other tools that we already know how to use, I think is for me the kind of most interesting path for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Right, well, thank you so much. Incredibly on time as well, and such a density of discussion while keeping within the time constraints. One couldn't have hoped for a better conversation. So we will open the discussion as well to the editorial board members in case there's questions, and the audience as well. Please do raise your hand so that we get a sense of how many of you want to ask a question and we can manage time a little bit. But I just wanted to say that what truly struck me in all the contributions is this kind of negation almost, or this resistance to kind of seeing code as fixity. I mean, of course, it is the ultimate fixity in many ways. It's a kind of constraint. It's a kind of framework, an infrastructure. But it seems that you're all discussing its performances, performativities, action around code, its temporalities. So I think it's been really wonderful to kind of see that manifest in all the pieces. Do we have any of our editorial board members? I will give you priority. If there's any questions, please do ask. David, yeah.
Yes, thank you to all the authors, and thank you, Theodora, and for organizing this, as well as Elise for her, as you said, tireless work on the journal. So, I think this idea of code it needs to be codified, it needs to be codified. But no, I think this idea of code is super important. What is code? Ultimately, it depends on how you interpret it, but for me, it's about language. It's about how we carve the world up into a symbolic order and make sense of it. And so, I think today with the proliferation of computational technologies, we are embedded in codes on so many levels, and those codes carry ideologies, biases. So, as an educator, I'm always thinking, what's the takeaway from a conversation like this, for a student or an early career practitioner. And so one question I would have is, undoubtedly, thinking about codes and specifically their kind of political ramifications is really crucial. Is there any advice or what does a young architect need to know or need to take away about codes that you think is critical?
Yeah, please do jump in, Anna Maria. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I mean, I'm gonna offer a very simple maybe answer. I think it's important to know that they come from intentionally made either things or regulations, or they come with intentions, however broad we want to see that. So to understand what these intentions are, and to understand who has an interest that the code either works or doesn't work, or that it's enforced or not, is crucial to then understand how to deal with it, I think. So it's really to not assume codes as a kind of given necessity. It goes to Bernard's article. It's like it's often used to depoliticize or ideologize regulations as just bureaucracy or just things that are given, but I think to understand that they come with intentions or from people with intentions, I think might be a first step.
I will also add to that codes can be broken. And in our era of like Grasshopper, these parametric tools and ways of thinking, and the more code is thrust upon us in terms of algorithms and deciding who and what we should say. I think having students learn how to break codes and that there are other ways of doing design and doing great design projects that do not include using Grasshopper. So I think making space for and showing the value and beauty I really think agency and how one senses how agentic they are tied to technological use. It's a hypothesis, but having them understand their agency by engaging in other ways of design that aren't or don't feel scripted, so that they're tethered to something that they think they ought to follow these rules. But no, breaking rules is good.
Yes, Peggy.
But I also feel, Vernelle, particularly because of your article, where I think you were trying to save a practice that was maybe going to disappear, that coding was a vehicle for saving the practice, that it serves a function to lodge something, maybe to use the phrase again, to make a stake in the ground, that isn't in the end inevitable or forever, but does solidify something that might be otherwise ephemeral. I guess I see codes in this way as dialectic, which is you establish something and then you critique it and then you refine it and overcome its biases. But I just wanted to say I appreciated that side of your piece.
Yes, I believe we also had a question from Farzan.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Sorry, I'm still nervous, even though I'm on the board. Like, it's such an incredible room. So let me just try to prepare my thoughts. I guess it's like a little bit, maybe it's like a hard question, but something that came out of this discussion for me, which is quite exciting, is in some way, exactly what you're saying now, Peggy, that critical theory gives us such a aversion to reading coded situations, and that sometimes coding can be good in certain ways. And so actually, if that's grounded by a ideological political project like labor rights, then we actually need to use some of these tools. And I think also for those of us who are skeptical of techno-utopian claims, and it had such a big impact in the field of architecture in the 90s to the 2000s, and we're still recovering from that in some ways. We're also like skeptical of some of these tools and computational code in some ways. So I'm kind of like reading, I guess, it's maybe like David's question again in a slightly different way. That where is the sort of intentionality? Like, how do you sort of not fall into the trap of critical analysis that tells you the same thing you already know, which is the world is sinister and computation is ever expanding and it's penetrating every part of our life. But then there's moments like what Bernard said, where media studies and architecture didn't understand each other because they're both trying to describe technical objects that they didn't understand. So no one's really understanding it, but that misalignment is really productive. And so surely the computational overlords are misunderstanding things as well. So I think there's just like, how do we not oversubscribe totalizing capacity to coded systems, but also how do we intentionally use them? I don't know. Is that a question? I don't know. But it was just like something that was coming out of the discussion, and maybe it's just like my own anxiety. I'm grappling with these same things. Like, how do we not get entrapped in these systems, but how do we navigate a way through them?
I have a comment, and I think my child's almost asleep by now, so I could actually finish the sentence. You know, again, I was probably talking about my own anxieties as much as anything else. One of the things I noticed is that some of the articles we're doing, and that certainly I did, probably my own essay, is there's this kind of, this is the problem with critique, right? There's like this ritualistic gesture of having to explain that code is not neutral. You know what I mean? And we all, and it's, and like, it's, I think that's part of the thing. Like on some level, like we all know that codes embody something like values. And yet, I don't know what it is about the society we live in where it's like, part of the reason we're paranoid is because we constantly feel like we have to explain it's not neutral, it's not neutral. And somehow, I don't think, you know, I don't know, somehow I think if we could start from this notion that generally codes affirm, right? Like affirm some type of collective relation, it would be easier to be a little less cynical or paranoid about it. But then there is something, I feel like there's something in our society that is so consistently depoliticizing some issues of the technical that it's hard to start from that affirmative place that says this is a collective relation, let's discuss how to negotiate it.
I'm going to build on that for just 1 second because it reminds me of something that struck me when Anna Marie in her article sort of hints at. There's a kind of Aristotelian question here, right? Form and matter. What is the real relationship? And in the end, you know, the code as a kind of device that describes, it's not the tree you're actually describing, right? It's the performance of tree. So the question for me is, and the one that we're not really talking about in the public realm with any of this is, what is the good? Which is, look, we're no longer Aristotelians, right? Because we're not looking at finished objects. We are, as Theodora pointed out, looking at things that are in process. We understand that it's socially constructed. We understand that it's fluid. We've sort of come to that, but we haven't figured out how to develop a language to evaluate that to the good, right? So my question would be, you know, what is that to serve? Who is that serving? Who's the agent behind that? And then how are we going to evaluate it? Where's the language for determining the good?
Thank you. Yeah.
I feel like I'm going to make a simplistic observation here, but my interest in technology, and it started with CAD/CAM and then it kind of went to BIM and stuff, was that these were tools that allowed us to work more communally and for architects to get out of their little head and work with fabricators and work with constructors and do that. And so I would just say simply one of the things to look at when we're evaluating, are these good or these bad, or how are we advising students to think about it, is like, do they help build a community of people who are producing the built environment such that we might be stronger in our voice against developers who seem to be leading how we're building the built environment? As in, these are tools that really, if used properly or understood properly, could really bring strong people together in a way that they're not right now.
Do we have other questions? Maybe from members of our audience? Would anyone? I guess in maybe closing, and if anyone has a burning question, please do jump in, or any remarks. I wonder if we can think of kinds of codes. Like it seems that like for me, and I might be completely kind of misconstruing the concept, there's a kind of fundamental question of like structure and action. Like it seems kind of that notion of code as a structuring concept, as a type of even temporary. I know you said at least that we recognize fluidity, but code introduces a type of temporary fixity within which certain performances, certain actions, certain possibilities kind of take place. So I think I wonder as Peggy was talking about different kinds of computational systems, I think the discussion can be quite different depending on the kind of level of specificity in which we're talking about, in the sense that, yes, information sharing starts suggesting a kind of communal activity that can be incredibly important as we reconsider our kind of professional and disciplinary identities. But then what are the kind of protocols? What are the technical specificities of that information sharing? And in what ways, like what kinds of codes are we then sort of enacting? So I wonder, instead of that notion of neutrality that, as Bernard was saying, we're sort of ritualistically negating, whether there is a kind of discussion of specificities, like codes as specific kind of protocols in some ways. Yeah, sorry, Ana Maria.
Yeah, I was thinking in my case, I mean, I think in a way what codes also are, which might help think in that about the specificity, is at least the codes that I write about, but also I think in some ways the codes we're talking about in terms of programming is a definition of allowable or tolerable tolerance. So in a way, they define how much deviation or how much space you need between things so they still fit, or how, at what point they circumscribe things or connections in a way so that they still fit and they don't obstruct each other, let's say, in very literally, physically, spatially, in the case of the norms that I write about or the codes that I write about. But I think also in terms of at least some of the other codes, again, with the large language models, I'm not so sure. I think there's other things at play, but that might be one way of saying there's a fixity, but also it's a protective fixity to kind of negotiate the space in between. Yeah.
So we're at 2:33. Are there any concluding comments or remarks by anybody, or otherwise we can?
But I have a question.
Yes.
So hi everyone. It's not really a question. It's more me thinking as I hear each one of you speaking. So we all agree, and we remind ourselves that code is not coding is not objective. In fact, it carries all the biases and the perceptions of those who use the code to code something, whether this is instructions or a recipe or anything. And I wonder what thoughts we have on how biased a code is from the way a code as a language is designed. I teach a course this semester where my students learn JavaScript, which is a programming language. And quite often I hear the question, well, why don't we learn Python, which is another programming language? And there are lots of similarities between the two languages. They use the same concepts, the same structures, the same way of thinking. So it doesn't really matter that much if you learn one language or another, as long as the structures between the two languages are similar. However, there might be languages that are very different in their structure. And therefore, those that have designed these languages also, in a similar sense, convey their biases into these languages. And for example, people tend to think differently from the way their own languages are structured. A person who learns French or Spanish or Italian might be thinking different than a person who speaks Japanese or Chinese or another language, just because these languages are very differently structured. So I wonder if we have any thoughts about how biased languages are, or how biased different ways of coding are because of the ways that these codes have been created as languages, as opposed to how biased a code is from a person who uses a code to code something. So I don't know if it makes sense or if that was clear, but that's just a reflection to everyone.
Does anyone have a comment?
I have like 100, but I'm gonna think about it.
We can do a special extended editorial board meeting discussing Dimitri's question.
Yeah, I think this was really great, Theodora. Excellent, really great beginning, guys. It sets a wonderful precedent for future discussions. So I just want to extend a thank you on behalf of the board for your participation in this, your willingness to try the relay format, which I think actually worked incredibly well, and for your collective thoughtfulness about these issues. I think that we couldn't have asked for more today from you, and I look forward to seeing snippets of these appearing in various coded environments throughout the world. Thank you so much. And thanks, Theodora. Bravo.
Oh, no, of course. No, thank you. I feel so yes, we will be, so there is a recording of the session that will be edited and made available on our TAD website, as well as snippets of the conversation that we will be sharing. It's truly, I just really want to say I appreciate so greatly your time and intellectual generosity throughout this process. It's also been really amazing to see you kind of activate each other's pieces in such wonderful ways. I mean, often when a reader goes through the issue, like one starts hallucinating these conversations, but it's great to actually have them. And yeah, just again a warm thanks to everybody and to our audience for being here today. So I think we can wrap it up, and I hope that some of the conversations will continue in other venues and formats as well.
I have one closing remark for people who are interested in thinking about technical coding of the world. I just got something in the mail today. Graph Vision.
Oh my gosh.
Digital Architecture Skeletons. Theodora's
yeah.
brand new book, which I think
thank you, Bernard.
it gets blurred by the codes of this machine, but it's a really, I encourage everyone to get their hands on it. It's I think one source for some of the inspiration of what made this such a robust issue.
Oh, that's incredibly generous, but I have to say that Bernard has actually written the book on code. And so I feel, I don't know, I've been reading his work for like ages. And so somehow I really appreciate that, but I'm going to plug your work right back in, because I think that this is really the piece to read. Also look up code, and everybody else, thank you so much for, it's also wonderful to see that all the pieces are really kind of reflecting work that is ongoing. So there's things to really look forward to. I think either in terms of kind of organized action in our professional associations to, you know, like the outcomes of your research group, Anna Maria, which is truly exciting. I don't know if there's going to be a next version of the exhibition, Adam and Vernelle, just your incredible kind of ongoing work with bringing some of these codes to life in like workshops and installations. So it's really, yeah, things to look forward to. Yeah.
Theodora, if any of y'all are coming to the ACSA conference, this show will be up at Tulane during the conference, so y'all get to see it there.
Oh,
Yay.
wow.
And I'd remind everyone who's listening or our listeners in the future, all of these articles are available online through Taylor and Francis through the TAD website. If you have ACSA membership, you have automatic access. But if you're interested, please reach out to one of the authors. They can also potentially give you a pass to let you in. And so that's possible. And some of these articles are open access already. So fabulous. So they're open source and downloadable.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. Really, this was so much fun.